You're listening to Rise of the Jumbies by Tracey Baptiste. Chapter 1 The Game. Corinne Lemur dove through the waves. Streaks of light illuminated the golden sand beneath her and shone on the large pink shell half buried in the seafloor, just out of reach. She kicked her feet and pushed harder towards it. Just as she was about to make a grab, a huge wave crashed down and a zillion salty bubbles and grains of sand blocked the shell from view. Corinne's lungs were bursting. She turned and swam to the surface. As soon as she came up, she spotted Buki and Malik closer to the shore. The grinning brothers had sea water dripping from their tightly curled hair. They bounced up, and Corinne realized too late that they were preparing to dive beneath a wave. The water came down, rolling her onto the gritty sand. The brothers had timed their dives perfectly to avoid being tumbled by the force of the crash. By the time Corinne surfaced again, they were gone. She took a deep breath and went under, fighting the urge to close her eyes against the stinging salt water so that she wouldn't miss the prize. And there it was, the shining pink seashell. She kicked her feet and reached towards it, and just as she got close enough, a pair of dark hands snatched the shell out of reach. Buki, the older brother, grinned. A few bubbles escaped from beneath his teeth, and he pushed up towards the sun. "Hey, hey!" he said, when Corinne joined him over the waves. "Fine, Buki, you win," Corinne said. "Say it," he said. "Say it." Corinne rolled her eyes. "You're—" But before she could finish, his little brother swam up behind and yanked the shell out of his hand. "Not king of the sea," Corinne finished. "Looks like Malik is." Buki dove after his brother. Corinne swam for shore. They had been in the water for hours. Her fingers were wrinkly, and her eyes burned. She dragged herself over to a coconut tree and sat against its curved trunk, sticking her legs straight out in the warm sand. Stripped shadows from the coconut leaves danced over her skin and the ground in front of her. To her left, a group of little girls held hands around a lopsided sand castle, dancing in a circle and singing, "In a fine sand castle, do you hear my missy-o? In a fine sand castle, do you hear my missy-o? Ours is the prettiest, do you hear my missy-o? Ours is the prettiest." The sand shivered. Corinne felt a tremor go straight through her body. The girls stopped dancing. The people on the beach stopped mid-action. But her papa and the other fishermen in their boats were still far out on the water, their nets dragging in the sea. None of them seemed to notice. She looked up at the sky. It was clear and quiet. Where are the seagulls? She wondered. The ground shook again. This time she got up. The group of girls ran to their parents, and the adults looked around with wide eyes. "Earthquake!" one of the women shouted. Corinne looked into the water again. There was no sign of the boys. "Get out of the water!" another voice yelled. Mothers with small children gathered them up and ran from shore. Lauren, one of Corinne's friends from the fishing village, rounded up his siblings, while his mother came behind with the baby. The second youngest, Abner, stumbled. Corinne reached for him, but his mother pushed Corinne's hand away and in a swoop tucked Abner under her free arm. "Mrs. Duval, I was only trying to help." Loren's mother cut a fearful glance at Corinne, and Corinne's face burned with embarrassment. Maybe it's just the earthquake, Corinne thought to herself, but it wasn't. She had been getting those looks like that for months. "It's okay," Loren said. "We have them." He smiled at Corinne, which made her feel better, but only for a little bit. She had barely seen Loren in weeks. His mother always found some chore for him to do any time they wanted to play. Corinne ran towards the waves. "Buki! Malik!" she shouted. The boys' heads bobbed out of the water. They were still fighting over the shell. "Get out!" she yelled. "Get out of the water!" At the water's edge, the waves pulled back as if the ocean were being drained. She ran to the boys with wet sand sticking under her feet. The edge of the water went farther and farther out, taking Buki and Malik with it. "Swim!" she yelled at them, waving her arms towards herself. Finally, Buki and Malik seemed to understand. They beat the path towards Corinne, but the sea was still pulling them away from shore. Corinne ran forward, towing the froth of the edge of the waves. She was just farther out than she had wanted to be with them playing. But where there was deep water enough to swim in, there was now only feet sucking sand. "Faster!" Water splashed on Corinne's toes. The tide was turning. The boys were closer, but so did the sea. Corinne stayed where she was, with the water licking at her feet, her ankles, and then surging up to her knees until the boys were close enough to grab and pull along. "Run!" Corinne commanded. All three of them took off towards the hill where they lived. But the waves crashed down around them, washing the sand away and pulling at their feet. One wave had barely turned back when another one overtook it and came at them again. It was the strongest tide Corinne had ever experienced. There was another rumble. Corinne and the boys scrambled over the rocky steps. Loose stones shook away beneath their feet, tripping them until they reached the dirt road. They stopped a moment with their hands on their knees to steady themselves and catch their breath. The ground stopped moving, but the waves kept coming, and they were bringing the fishing boats in fast, right to where they stood. Corinne's papa's yellow boat crashed into other vessels as it rushed towards the shore. Her father's eyes found her. He pointed frantically at their house at the top of the hill. Corinne nodded once and pulled the boys behind her. Malik stumbled, and Bookie helped him to his feet. "Come on, brother," Bookie said. Malik patted his back pockets and looked around. His slingshot spun on the surface of the water. He reached for it, but it was drowning into a muddy whirlpool. "I'll make you another one," Bookie said, as he made sure he still had his own. They continued up the hill and paused near the house to look over the beach, which was now covered in brackish water, tree limbs, and splintered wood. The small brown object, round like a bare head, bobbed by, and for a moment Corinne's heart stopped. But there were others, green ones, yellow ones, coconuts. Corinne realized with relief, all drifting in the water. As they floated, Corinne saw a couple of them get sucked under like Malik's slingshot and then disappear. She looked to the pileup of boats that had run aground, but her papa's was not among them.